Hello and welcome back to CamBro Conversations. Today's conversation, we're going down the rabbit hole on a big topic that I've been really interested to do on the podcast since I started just over 2 years ago now. That topic's caffeine, and the guest to help me do so is Mr. Ben Esgro. Ben, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me and finding me, as we discussed prior to the call.
Yes. I do my research on who would be the best equipped guest to discuss particular topics, and that doesn't necessarily mean that person has a big glitzy Instagram profile. But as we discussed, Ben, you've done numerous interviews, you've been on countless podcasts speaking in depth across supplementation and stimulants, and that equips you really well, because one of the things that stands out about you is obviously you've got your master's in pharmaceutical sciences, but of course you've been at the forefront of supplements for well over a decade now with De Novo and now with elemental formulations. That equips you to be somebody that applies to the kind of audience that would listen to a podcast like this, who are interested in like the health and their fitness, but also their cognitive performance and work. And if I purely went for somebody that had posted a reel that was absolutely smashing out of the park with a couple of facts about caffeine that was really interesting but quite surface level, then we'd burn out quite quickly, and somebody might get some key takeaways, but we can go much deeper and somebody can get a really thorough understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, that is my forte, and that is definitely long form is I feel like where I shine. If you give me 30 seconds, I don't know if you'll get anything useful. So maybe you could clip 30 seconds from here, but I would much prefer to get into the nuance and really all of the things that make physiology, pharmacology, formulating interesting to me. I mean, that's really where my passion on these topics comes from. And my knowledge is that I'm genuinely just interested in how the human body works and how you can alter consciousness in any way. I think that's so fascinating. And you know, the reality, without getting way too far ahead of ourselves, is like, you know, caffeine is psychoactive. Like it's a stimulant. It changes your conscious experience of life. And that's just very, very fascinating to me. That's something a plant makes that we just happen to stumble upon and brew a tea out of, or brew something, you know, out of in hot water. We find that, oh man, it makes me feel great. I need to have it every day, and it makes me feel like I have more energy and happier. That's amazing. Like, it's almost like people think that drug companies existed forever, and like methamphetamine was just out there growing on the meth plant. And no, we've had stimulants as long as we've been on the planet. And again, I'll stop there. But I think the last thing I'll say is arguably safer and more sustainable ones than the pharmaceutical ones that are available.
Yeah, exactly that, Ben. So I guess if we were to define our terms before we go into caffeine as a drug and a supplement or a stimulant, can you define pharmacology for us?
Sure. Yeah. So pharmacology is basically the study of drugs and their impact on physiology. So how drugs work. You can really divide it into branches. You can talk about pharmacokinetics, which is basically liberation of a drug, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion. So if you ever see something pop up where you're looking at studies or you're looking at something more technically written, and it's talking about the pharmacokinetics, that's basically all the areas that it will cover in that discipline. And then pharmacodynamics is defining the mechanism of action of, you know, how this thing works. Another, I think, better way to put it that I've had in classes is pharmacokinetics is how the body handles the drug, and then pharmacodynamics is how the drug impacts the body.
Yeah, that's exactly how I split it in my research for this conversation. And I think the first area I'd love to go with you would be understanding what are the pharmacokinetics of caffeine. So that would be how the body handles caffeine when it takes it on board.
Yeah. So the nice part about caffeine is it's one of the most studied stimulants we have. I think for numerous reasons. There's medicinal value in caffeine really throughout the lifespan. You know, from infants to elderly, there's applications of caffeine use. So that has driven, I think, a lot of the research behind it. We know that it's very well absorbed. It's like 99% bioavailable. So if you take 100 milligrams of caffeine, about 99 milligrams will be yielded to systemic circulation and available to tissues to utilize. There's an interesting sort of slight segue to get into with that, just because I've seen in pre-workouts this popularization of caffeine salts, and they're not a necessity. We know that caffeine in its base form, so caffeine anhydrous, or what's present in a tea or a coffee, we know that that's extremely bioavailable. Usually drug companies or supplement companies will make a salt of a poorly bioavailable ingredient. And the reason they do that is to make it more water soluble. And solubility is a very important aspect. But what makes caffeine so bioavailable is it's called amphoteric, which basically means it's water soluble enough and it's fat soluble enough that it can dissolve in liquid, which is the medium of the human body, and it can pass through cell membranes, which are as anyone who's taken basic biology has heard, is the lipid phospholipid bilayer. So you have to basically, for a drug to be active and get dissolved and absorbed into the body, it has to be able to pass. It has to be slightly water soluble and slightly fat soluble. So there's this really ideal range that you need to operate it within, and caffeine is
caffeine ticks that box, to enable it to have the maximal uptake of what you take. So you mentioned there 100 milligrams, almost 99% of that is being absorbed by the body. So it's very effective from that perspective. And
so the argument I've seen made of the marketing of caffeine salts is they'll hit faster, but the reality is when you take caffeine anhydrous or you drink a tea or anything, you peak blood levels from 15 to 90 minutes. So it's fast. Like you're not going to get much faster than that. And one of the advantages is when you look at different delivery systems of any compound, like one of them, so technically a supplement can only be orally provided, whereas a drug can be injection, it could be a patch, it can be multiple, like transdermal. But the interesting aspect of things like caffeine and nicotine is because they are lipophilic enough, they can pass through plasma membranes, you can actually get buccal absorption. So you'll get some absorption of caffeine even in the cheek, under the tongue. So the reality is you're already starting to absorb some caffeine before it even, gets through the small intestine, gets in the small intestine. So basically the real key point there is we don't need to make salts of caffeine because there's an issue with how quickly it gets into the blood, or how efficiently it does so.
And it gets in pretty quickly indeed, but not immediately, because some people, when we were discussing before we hit record, there's some bad habits within the fitness space where people expect their caffeine that they have maybe during a training session to have an impact on that training session. But we can get into that in a little bit. But I'd love to learn just a little bit more about how does the body react to caffeine? What's going on there?
Sure. Yeah, well, on that topic, actually, the only way you'd get immediate is by an injection, which is no longer a supplement. So that's eliminated as an option anyway. So really, the next aspect to touch on is what's called first pass. So after caffeine would be absorbed, everything that's consumed orally is going to go to the liver first. Basically, the liver is going to decide what to do with it, if it's going to deactivate it or allow it to kind of pass into systemic circulation. There's not significant or extensive first pass metabolism of caffeine. So basically, like I said, 99% bioavailable. So 99 of those 100 are going to get into the blood and be able to, act on tissues. Once it is into the blood, obviously, when you take caffeine, you're not stimmed forever. Like you need to typically redose. So the way that we measure how quickly it's metabolized and broken down and eliminated is something called half-life. So it's a marker of metabolism. And the caffeine half-life is variable, and that's largely dependent on genetic factors, also some behavioral factors. One of those things is a liver enzyme called CYP1A2. It's the primary pathway that caffeine is degraded and deactivated, and that varies between individuals. So I know, for instance, I'm a slow metabolizer of caffeine, so it will stay more active in me. So the half-life for me will be longer versus somebody who, let's just say, if you observe people, someone who needs to drink a cup of coffee like every hour to kind of keep feeling it or something. For me, I take caffeine at noon and I feel it until almost bedtime. So that's the long-winded way of saying that there is a variable half-life of caffeine. It is not this firmly established 3-4 hours. It's actually anywhere from 2 to 9 hours. So if you take the average, it would be around 5 hours that caffeine is active at that level until half of it. That's why it's called half-life. So if, let's say you took that 100 milligrams, 5 hours later, you'd be at 50, and then another 5 hours later, you'd be at 25. It's not like, so it takes a while. It takes a while until it's completely eliminated from your system.
I think that's where we really need to go in depth of the impact of when you're using caffeine within your day. And if we first go to it absorbing into the body in order to have an impact. So for example, you said it was 15 to 90 minutes. So if I'm thinking about that from a practical implementation for my training, and if I'm wanting it for a training performance benefit, I need to be having that at least 15 to 90 minutes before I'm doing my important working sets, I suppose, within my training. If we're talking about resistance training, for example, in a typical sense, whereas I was laughing with you again, like I said before we hit record, that you do see some people carrying their pre-workout or their energy drink round the gym with them, when really the impact on their session and their performance is going to be negligible from that beverage, because it's going to be after the fact when they finish up their session, unless they're training for a hugely extended period of time. That's a little bit of a waste.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where there's answers on paper, and then there's also sort of personality and personal preference aspects. So I think if you were to say like what's ideal on paper, I would say, you should drink your energy drink pre-workout probably on the way to the gym if you want it to peak once you get there. You could also drink it during your warm-ups, assuming people warm up. I hope they do, because you'd have about 15 minutes of warm-up, then you'd start, reaching peak plasma concentrations around when you start getting to your work sets. But someone like me, which is interesting, is like I'll drink a pre-workout or a caffeine source usually after I wake up and have breakfast. Again, that's partially because it lasts so long for me that I'll use it almost for work and my workout. And by the time, 3-4 hours later, when I'm getting to the gym, I'm still kind of relatively feeling it and peaked enough that I'm getting those benefits, those psychological benefits as well of, like perceived exertion reduction, stuff like that. So it is, there is, I guess, an ideal on paper, but, there's certainly room for fitting it into how it works best for you as an individual as well. I just think the big thing is understanding that caffeine does impact sleep, and sleep is a big aspect of recovery. And, once we talk a little bit about pharmacodynamics, I think I'll be able to illuminate why exactly it does impact sleep, and it's directly related to how caffeine works and produces its stimulation. Yeah,
almost as a little bit of a teaser to that, then you're talking about half-life there, and you're saying for the average person, which most people listening to this will be somewhere in the middle and somewhere around that, is roughly 5 hours. So if we're talking about a typical pre-workout drink, I absolutely love a Monster or a Reign, and that's maybe 150 meg. I've still got 75 meg in my system 5 hours later. And if I train in the evening and I take it very close to my workout, then I am going to sleep with 75, or I'm attempting to go to sleep or attempting to enter sleep with 75 meg in my system, which is not insignificant.
It's not. And that's the thing is, there are ideal ranges of where alertness and the psychoactive components are maximized, but it doesn't mean that 75, just because you don't feel it as a stimulant, doesn't impact sleep. It does. It's not the same sleep. And that is pretty well established. Just like people who use, benzos or drugs to sleep, like sedatives, that is not the same sleep architecture as someone who fell asleep not under the influence of drugs. It's actually
alcohol as well, Ben.
Yeah, exactly. And
using alcohol to get sleep.
That's why alcohol actually works on GABA. That's partly why people feel loosened up from consuming alcohol. It's just that a lot of the GABA active drugs are quite a bit more potent and arguably more dangerous than alcohol as well.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And when we're talking about the considerations of timing around your training, of course, you've got to have the mental trade-off of will this impact my sleep and my recovery? Because ultimately, I know, for example, whenever I have a deload week, I pretty much don't have any caffeine, and we're going to get into maybe whether that's necessary or not as we go. I'd love to learn that from you. But I find that some of my sessions are absolutely fine, even without caffeine. But my sleep is incredible because I'm having no caffeine at all for like a week. And I'm like, wow, like, I just sleep like a baby. I wake up even more fresh. So even the small amount that I maybe have left in my system, if I tell you my caffeine habits as we go through the discussion, that's still impacting my sleep in some way, because when I have none, I find my sleep's even better and I'm more rested, which is definitely a sticking point versus my slight addiction and passion for a cold white monster.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the socially acceptable addiction to have, drug addiction to have. But I think another fascinating aspect is, I'll rewind a little bit to talking about metabolism of caffeine and CYP1A2. The primary metabolite is actually something called paraxanthine. So it's demethylated at one of the positions. So caffeine is trimethylxanthine. Trimethylxanthine, it's 137, where there's carbon kind of projecting off of the ring. And I forget exactly which one that CYP1A2 demethylates, but you make paraxanthine, a compound called paraxanthine. And paraxanthine is actually psychoactive as well. So what's fascinating is, it's true that, 5 hours later, roughly, you will have half of the amount of caffeine floating around, but you'll also have paraxanthine, which is psychoactive as a stimulant. So there's a lot to account for, and that's a large reason why when I said I'm using caffeine, I use it as early in the day as I can, because if I take it at 5, I'm not sleeping until 4 in the morning.
Yeah, because of how slowly you metabolize it and how your personality reacts to it as well, which is interesting. Have you done some tests which understand how you, like, what genetic you have?
So I used 23andMe. It's a pretty popular genotyping service. They send you a spit kit, which is how they. I'm not sure. Well, you can extract DNA from saliva, so I'm guessing that's how they do it, and then they probably amplify it, like with PCR or something. But anyway, you get a full report. And I did it early before the FDA intervened for a bit and you couldn't get the health reports. So I had the health reports and all of the ancestry aspects too. Now I'm pretty sure that they have pulled back that FDA regulation to where people who use it now can get the health reports again. But anyway, what's really fascinating about that is, you do get, it tells you that, if you're a caffeine fast or slow metabolizer based on your CYP1A2 genotyping. But man, if for anybody who's nerdy or just loves technical information, you can actually dive into individual chromosomes and look at your individual polymorphisms and see many things. Like, you can use external services. One of them is called Prometheus, where you could dig into a bunch of individual, they're called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, and how those impact personality, and like any research that's been done on any of those different individual codes that you have. So totally worth it. I think when I did it was 100. I think it's still around that, but it'll give you caffeine.
Which is a great takeaway, because it means that you've shaped your habits around that, haven't you?
Yeah. And it'll give you other interesting stuff that you're going to know anyway. But it's like, okay, it just helps me know it's accurate. Like, likely to have brown hair, likely to bald. So I would have known that already, but thank you, 23andMe, for confirming what has happened.
In terms of moving forward, then the pharmacodynamics of caffeine, what can we learn about that?
Yeah. So I think what's fascinating is, it works on a few different mechanisms. One of the ones that people will have heard of is it works on the adenosine receptor. Prior, most of the effects of caffeine were thought to be related to working on phosphodiesterase, it's PDE. But actually now the current accepted mechanism is it's largely most potent in working on adenosine receptors. And that's what's producing pretty much all of the physiological effects. And the reason that they've confirmed is a bad word, but let's just use it for sake of keeping the conversation going. The reason they've confirmed it is they've been able to look at relative potency of how it acts on these receptors, and it seems to be the most potent at adenosine receptors. So where adenosine receptors tie into this entire conversation is it's a natural receptor in your body that's present, and the endogenous, so the ligand or the key that fits into that receptor in normal physiology is adenosine. You make adenosine, you basically cleave ATP, and you create free adenosine throughout the day. And adenosine, when it builds on the receptor and it sticks to it, and you get a bunch floating around and a bunch of interactions at the receptor, it's one of the major factors in fatigue and producing sleep pressure, as it's been called. So basically, adenosine is very important in signaling sleep-wake cycling. How caffeine works is it looks similar to adenosine, and that means chemically it looks similar, the structure, but it's able to competitively fight for docking at that receptor with adenosine. And if you have enough present, it can actually bind the receptor and stop adenosine from interacting. And there's then multiple kind of downstream implications of that. One is that obviously you get short-term wakefulness. When adenosine docks the receptor, as you'd imagine, it also impacts different neurotransmitters in the central nervous system, like dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, things that actually make you feel wakeful. So when you block that receptor, when you block adenosine from interacting, you actually can get more release of those wakeful promoting neurotransmitters. That's why people say, well, if it just works on adenosine receptors, why do I have dopaminergic effects from caffeine? Why do I have increases in heart rate that are traditional, like adrenergic effects from caffeine? And that's why, is when you're blocking that receptor, you're actually stopping adenosine's inhibition on releasing those neurotransmitters.
It's a gateway to other feelings and other effects.
Yes, exactly. And there's a more direct one, which now I'm going on a stretch here. So anybody who's a purist scientist you're welcome to call me out. I'm calling myself out on it. But my understanding and theory of why caffeine has such an addictive property is actually adenosine receptors are functionally coupled to dopamine receptors. So basically what that means is when you block the adenosine receptor, you actually will allow more dopamine release. And when adenosine's acting on dopamine receptor, you will reduce dopamine release. And think about it, practically when you're really tired, you're usually grumpy, you're usually moody, you're usually not super motivated. So it's, there's a lot of direct effects from adenosine blocking, but then there's a lot of indirect ones, which explains the broad effects of caffeine. I'll stop there because I kind of ran on and rambled a bit, and I don't want to misdirect the conversation.
No, I think that's valuable from a scientific perspective to understand what's going on within our bodies when the substance comes in, and which of the parts of our body and our brain and our mind and our cells it interacts with. Mm-hmm. But I'd love to know, you mentioned there things like reduction in tiredness, increase in slight wakefulness, probably a reduction in like perceived level of exertion as well. That's why it's so useful as a training tool. What are some of those headlines in terms of this happens within my body, within adenosine? What does that actually mean for me in the day to day? Yeah,
so those neurotransmitters I talked about, they're called catecholamines, and they're largely implicated in motivation, energy, wakefulness. So really anything that fits into those categories are what you're going to feel more. I mean, obviously anybody who's consumed caffeine will know that and feel that. But that's largely what you're getting. And a lot of that increased heart rate, like I said, is coming from that indirect effect on things like norepinephrine and pressor drugs, like they're called. But yeah, I think the big one is usually is dopamine, because dopamine is a stimulant, but it's also very potent at motivation. So I think a big part that you're experiencing with that caffeine hit is more related to the indirect effects on the neurotransmitters from the offshoot of blocking adenosine receptors. Yes. Real quick, I think something to mention there as well is caffeine crash, because that's such a heavily marketed thing. where companies will just make up these ridiculous claims like we put vitamins into our formula to prevent caffeine crash and all of that nonsense. The reality is, like I said, the mechanism is an adenosine receptor antagonist, and it's competitive. So what that means is you still have adenosine floating around there. So once caffeine is bound to the adenosine receptor, once it unbinds, all of that adenosine can come in, and usually it's building up, like it's not disappearing. Really, the only way to wash away adenosine from the receptor is to sleep. So that explains multiple aspects of why it's important to not have caffeine around bedtime, but also why people feel that crash, and they'll feel that really rapid pull away once caffeine starts to be metabolized. And it's like, man, I felt great and I've just fallen off the cliff and I've crashed. And it's largely because, if you take caffeine because you're underslept, that means you have adenosine built up. So short term, you can compete with that. You can stop the adenosine from exerting its effects. But as soon as the caffeine wears off and metabolizes, you're going to get this flood of adenosine at receptors and you're going to feel like garbage. And if you do that chronically over time, you're going to chronically feel like garbage. You need to sleep.
Are you familiar with the phrase robbing Peter to pay Paul?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So I was just checking that made its way across the Atlantic. So that is exactly what that screams to me in terms of if you are chronically fatigued and you're masking it with an agent, a supplement like caffeine, you are just stealing from the next day's recovery.
Yep.
And what ultimately you need to do is cleanse the adenosine from the body through restorative deep sleep.
Yep.
And if by not doing, and by like maybe putting off some of the tiredness that you've got today, you're just going to be in the same situation tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. And it's a never ending, unfortunate cycle.
It is. And, I'll be honest that it's a hard thing to kick. I mean, it really does have reinforcing effects. Like caffeine withdrawal is a real thing. And that's pretty classic of most compounds that work on dopamine. Like withdrawal usually becomes a part of removing that compound from your daily habits. So it's hard. And that happens at fairly low doses. But it's also why, like, again, just to get to something practical that I've implemented from just learning more about caffeine and neurotransmitters is like I set myself a hard limit on caffeine, which is 400. And that's based upon knowing that once I pass 400 in a day, I will have withdrawal the next day, like pretty consistently. So if I stay below 400, usually the next day I can go without caffeine, without like a terrible headache and not being completely useless productivity wise. And that is also the currently accepted upper intake for caffeine of daily amount where there's really no negative effects shown.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that does lead us on to dosages, because if we're thinking about gym performance or cognitive performance, what are some of the levels of intake that are required to start to feel those effects?
Yeah, cognitive is surprisingly low. So using body weight, it's a 0.5 milligram per kilo up to 4 milligrams per kilo. So pretty wide range. But I think what you'll notice immediately if you think about a lot of commercial products that are out there, like that means like a lot of sodas will actually hit that low amount. Or something as simple as like a cup of coffee can vary, but it could be like 40 to 80. So that's why, people will have their morning coffee or tea. So you are hitting that cognitive benefit range, usually with fairly low or less potent sources. And then when you get into physical performance, it goes pretty high end, really anywhere from 3 to 5 milligrams per kilo. So assuming 100 kilogram person, that gets up to pretty high intakes. Now there have been studies that have gone higher, like 7 to 9. It just seems to be that you don't tend to get much better after 5 milligrams per kilo. And of course, which is true of anything with dosing, is the higher you go, the more probability you also have for side effects. So you may feel more stimulated at 9 milligrams per kilo versus 5, but you're also going to have a much higher likelihood of feeling anxiety, feeling jitters, feeling a worse crash, withdrawal, all those things.
Yeah, and even, and not to be too graphic, but caffeine can be a bit of a diuretic when it comes to the bathroom as well. So if you're trying to train and you're constantly needing to go pee or otherwise,
Sure.
that's going to be a bit of a distraction for you. I think one of the studies that I saw a number of years ago now was around that 5 to 6 mark, where it was like 5 to 6 milligrams per kilo body weight. And I worked it out. That would mean for me, I'm normally between like 72 to like 80 kilos, depending how lean I am. And I would be taking like 380 milligrams of caffeine at the bottom end of that in like one dose before the gym. And I know for a fact I would have the shakes. Like, I don't have a particularly high tolerance for it. I probably have one caffeinated drink per day on a training day only. And I feel a little bit of buzz from it. I feel like I talk quicker. I'm a bit more energized. If I for whatever reason on a day, if I had like maybe some pre-workout and then I had the drink earlier in the day as well, and it's maybe still in my system. Yep. Wow, I'm like shaky. My hands are like going, and it's not actually conducive to great performance. And I know if I had 380 milligrams at, I don't know, say I was training at 5 o'clock at night and I took it at, even at 3 is my cutoff. 10 p.m. when I'm trying to wind down, I am still full of caffeine and not even close to sleeping.
Definitely. Yeah. Again, this gets into talking about more slightly other pathways, but ones that bleed into the caffeine conversation that I've mentioned before, like adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and that fight or flight response. So what's interesting is, again, like I said, effects are dose dependent, and you will get a scaled effect from, let's say you go up to double the dose you're used to, you will get, I don't know if necessarily I'd say double the stimulation, but more than prior if you've doubled the dose. And one of those things, like I said, that the caffeine will affect is epinephrine, or let's just use the common term, adrenaline. And there is also, funny enough, you can get that information from 23andMe as well. You will have a what's the word I'm looking for? A binary response to adrenaline release, whereas some people, that's why they call it fight or flight response. Some people actually the way they define it in common articles that talk about is the worrier versus warrior gene, and that actually drives your response to adrenaline release. So if you go on that high end, you are more likely, if you're a warrior, it might actually work well for you. You might actually have a better workout. You might get more aggressive, more zoned in. If you're a warrior, it could be much worse, where you're going to be panicked. You're going to get a lot of anxiety. And I think that's why we anecdotally or observationally, we see some people say, I love high caffeine. And some people say, oh my God, it gives me terrible anxiety. It gives me terrible jitters. It's not really the compound that is changing, it's how it's interacting with the person's in unique
genetic code. Yeah, and I wonder if there's an overlap between those individuals that metabolize very quickly and whether you're a worrier or a warrior. That would be an interesting.
Is fascinating. I can say I can certainly give you an N of 1, and I am a slow metabolizer, and I am balanced but favoring worrier side. So I wonder if there's a slow metabolizer and warrior side. But I mean, I have my parents' information, and I know my mom is warrior but fast metabolizer. So we may have just made the start of someone publishing a new study on caffeine, and
if it reaches the right ears, we can be involved in that.
Yeah, they better credit this podcast. Damn it.
What impact does the source that we have? So for example, you mentioned it needs to be water soluble and fat soluble, but is there any impact on whether I take it from a pre-workout powder, or a caffeine capsule, which is very popular, or of course an energy drink or a cup of coffee? Yeah,
there doesn't appear to be, and they have studied that. They've actually compared all 3 of them or 4 of them, like tea, capsules, coffee, energy drink, and they all seem to peak around the same time. You seem to have relatively the same bioavailability from all of them. So it doesn't seem that that's a major factor.
Yeah. One of the things that always strikes me is that sometimes some of the for example, the fizzy drinks that you have a little bit of an acidic profile. And I think sometimes if you were to take them during a workout, your stomach might be in fight or flight, like you were saying, depending on how you respond to that kind of thing as well?
Yeah, I mean, you need to consider carbonation is gas. I mean, it's carbon dioxide trapped in cold liquid. So if you drink it down fast, that's why you burp. I mean, you have to eliminate that carbon dioxide. And interestingly enough, again, this is sort of tangential, but why, in the past when I've competed in bodybuilding shows and dieted for extended periods of time, that's why I would really prefer diet soda, because it would help me feel full. Because again, it's gas, and gas causes expansion. So yeah, that certainly is a factor, especially if you're chugging, an energy drink that's carbonated. It will definitely make you feel a little more bloated versus a slow consumption of coffee or something else.
Yeah. Given your knowledge of how you respond to caffeine, you mentioned you use it in the morning before like to work, but then also before you work out. How do you find dosing it in terms of what are the benefits for you when you're maybe doing some deep work on your laptop and studies or writing something?
Typically, yeah, an important qualification of that is that it's got to be a big enough dose for me. Like if I take 100 milligrams, I do feel that I crash earlier than anticipated, and it's not an improvement in productivity. So I usually take what would be called a bolus dose, so one large dose for the day, and it's usually around 300. Like for example, today I got up around 10:30, so I'm not an early riser by any means. So I ate, and then I had about 300, 350, and then that'll be it for the day. So I won't redose. I won't take any more or anything like that. And that's enough. So, I mean, that was, like I said, that was now 4 or 5 hours ago, and I feel comfortably peaked. And
energetic, yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And when you pushed it over the 400 that you said is your tolerance, work output less, you don't do so well?
I'd say I'm a little more distracted, a little more racy thoughts, a little more it's more difficult to stay on task. Like I'm more just jumpy in general. I'll feel it longer. Obviously we talked about half-life, it'll be more active dose later. My sleep is typically worse, and then the next day is usually worse as well.
And in terms of, and this is not just from your own perspective and your own experience, Ben, different types of training probably respond to different types of protocols when it comes to caffeine, I imagine. So we're talking about, and I think you were saying that the higher end is that like 9 milligrams per kilo, which is just crazy in my in my mind. I don't even know how I would consume that without passing out. But having it at that lower end, like what training has that been tested against, I suppose, in terms of the benefits? So is it like your traditional resistance training? Is it 1 rep max? Is it strongman? What kind of training is it?
That's a good question. I can only give a limited response because I will admit I am not encyclopedic when it comes to the studies that have been performed. I mean, I know some people who can name the author of the study, the name of the study, all of that stuff. I usually just remember the takeaways. So off the top of my head, what I do know is a lot of stuff. It's been cycling where they've looked at it. I know there have been strength training studies where they have gone higher, like 7 to 9. But I think practically the way I'd look at it is start low, go slow. So start as low as you can, as you need to. Like just because you've read a study that says 7 to 9 is the best for strength training doesn't mean you should go right up to 7 to 9. Like if you don't know your sensitivity, that could be unbelievably you're going to have, like they say in South Park, you're going to have a bad time. So I think it should always be on an as needed basis. And I think you also need to take the full scope of everything into context if you are considering an increasing dose. And I know people don't like this. People are like, oh man, like it's just not fun. You're not giving fun advice. But I think if you really are starting to have problems where you find you need caffeine just to function, to do anything or to be motivated, I think you do need to take a look at these things. And one of them is find really like start at 100 and see how that feels. Do you feel anything? Give yourself a half hour, 45 minutes to let it peak. okay, if that's not, maybe go 150, maybe go 2, maybe go 250. It like, and you could do this sort of within the same day. Like you only have to wait 15, 20 minutes, or start with the half scoop of the pre-workout, and before you go to a full. Because once it's in your body, there's nothing you could do to get it out of there. You got to deal with it for those 5 to 6 hours. So always start low, like I said, and kind of go slower up.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the best way with any form of protocol, isn't it? To minimum effective doses tends to be the best protocol, because is it possible to build a tolerance to caffeine? So, for example, I see people chasing the same high that they got before by having more. Is that actually being reflected in what's going on inside their body, or is that a mental thing?
That's a great question. I know that the affinity doesn't change, like the binding to the adenosine receptor doesn't change, but it does seem, and this has been more recent where I've seen that it does seem that the neurotransmitter response begins to get blunted over time. And I think that's why people seem to note that they lose their sensitivity. I don't think that's necessarily what's happening, because I think it's still binding adenosine receptor. But just like anything, like your body always has some type of physiological response to putting in any outside substance, and usually that means that metabolism will get upregulated. Like it's going to do something to save you from, like to keep homeostasis, to keep things normalized. So I think once it realizes that, oh man, we've seen this thing before, we don't need to flood the system with neurotransmitters. It's likely that's what happens. It doesn't seem that 1A2, the pathway that metabolizes caffeine, doesn't seem that gets upregulated by caffeine intake. But what's interesting, and why this isn't just a straight, easy answer, is other things can impact 1A2 induction. So they can actually block 1A2 independently, or they can cause your body to start producing more 1A2. One of those things is smoking. So if you're a smoker, you will actually induce 1A2 and produce more of it, and you will be a faster caffeine metabolizer versus whether you would have if you hadn't smoked. And then things like birth control. So particularly for females who are on any type of hormonal birth control, that will actually make them more sensitive to caffeine. So those are things, and actually an SSRI as well will block 1A2. It's fluvoxamine, and that will cause you to have higher blood levels of caffeine versus if you weren't taking that drug. So that's certainly an important distinction there as well. It's not just one factor. Like physiology is complicated.
Yeah, of course. It's not just a case of this one particular person responds really differently to caffeine because of this one factor. It might be because of the genetics, but also because of the other lifestyle factors they've got, maybe smoking, birth control, SSRIs, lots of different things that go on there.
The other thing that I think needs to be considered within that is if you're chronically taking caffeine and you're taking it late and it's affecting your sleep, although you don't think it is, and it's a high enough dose, part of the issue might not be that you've lost sensitivity to caffeine. It's that you chronically have adenosine. And, when you talk about competitive inhibition or competitive antagonism on a purely biochemical basis, it's amounts. So, if you have more present, you can actually overcome the natural. So like if there's a lot of caffeine present, you can overcome the adenosine binding at the receptor, versus if there's a lot of adenosine, you're not going to get the same binding and effect of caffeine. And I think that's partly what's happening with people who think that they've lost sensitivity. It's just that they're chronically underslept and they're chronically over-caffeinating to try to beat it out on a dose perspective. And you can. So like if you're escalating and you usually take 100 and that stopped working and you're undersleeping, but you take 400, like I said, now you've upped the dose, you've changed the equation. So you probably will feel something, but you're not addressing the root of the problem, which is not your caffeine insensitivity.
Yeah, it's the fact that you're not clearing the adenosine through sleep.
Correct. Yep.
Wow, sleep's the answer to an awful lot of our problems, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, caffeine's very sexy, and maybe having an extra can or an extra cup of coffee might feel great at the time, but we are, like we say, that horrible phrase, robbing Peter to pay Paul. With the information you've shared there, is it worthwhile when I have my deload weeks to remove caffeine?
I think, again, I think that's probably more of a personal preference thing. I don't see a necessity for it. I think, for someone like me, I never have in practice. I've never recommended it. I don't recommend against it. For me, like, I've never actually felt like I've lost caffeine sensitivity. So that's why I've never seen a reason. And I do like the productivity enhancement I get from just my day-to-day tasks. So I like taking caffeine daily, whether I'm lifting or not. But I think if someone finds that it helps kind of refresh their perspective, and I actually think I've heard people say, like, I've regained my sensitivity, I've regained the potency of caffeine. I think, like you have said earlier, what most likely happened is they got better sleep, less interrupted sleep for a week straight, and now they actually have just have less adenosine floating around.
That would make terrific sense in terms of you've had better quality sleep, so you've cleared that away. So when the caffeine comes back in, even from a slightly lesser dose, you probably start to feel the effects quicker. You although genetically you haven't changed your genetic code, you become a faster responder and a lower dose responder because there's less adenosine interacting with the caffeine.
Yeah, you've sort of reset, and that will happen with many things. Is like I was talking about before, like induction or upregulation. Let's use like a classical example of induction is like alcohol intake. So an alcoholic gains tolerance to alcohol because they get induction of a different CYP enzyme. It's P450, and so you will start producing more P450 to metabolize ethanol, so you don't kill yourself. It's an adaptation to retain survival. Now, if you stop consuming alcohol for a fairly, I don't know how long the period would be, but let's just say like a week or a couple months, you will have a lower tolerance now because you've removed that thing that's driving the adaptation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I've been just over 2.5 years. I've just removed alcohol. I've gone alcohol free from a kind of productivity tool perspective. But even before that, I drank very sporadically. Maybe since university, I would pick 4 or 5 events during the year, like maybe like my birthday, my brother's birthday, a holiday. And my tolerance for alcohol from when I used to drink at university, like maybe once a week or whatever, going to the student night and £1 drinks and stuff like that, my tolerance is just through the floor. Like I'm tipsy after like 3 drinks. Whereas at university,
cheap date, man. So am I.
Yeah, exactly. So, but at university, I wasn't a heavyweight by any shape or form. I wasn't able to drink other people under the table. Yeah, but man. I wouldn't be the drunkest earliest, or at least I wouldn't be feeling the effects and have to be like, right, okay, I'm gonna go 1 drink for every 2 that he has, so that I'm like respectable here.
yeah, exactly.
So it's funny how our tolerance to different substances differs based on the inner workings of the body.
Yeah, I mean, you think about adaptation, and it's true, and this is why I loved going into pharmacy and getting more of an education on that. Is it helped me see physiology through a whole new lens and see the universal aspects of how these things apply to what prior I felt like I had a pretty deep base of knowledge on, which was resistance training and fitness topics. And you see that, your body, when you push adaptation, your body's really only doing it out of necessity. It doesn't want to allocate that much energy unless it has to. So it's just like with resistance training, you remove that stimulus, your body's not going to adapt. Like, it's not just going to grow muscle because you've willed it to happen. You kind of have to push it and force it to do that. And it's the same when you talk about chemical stimulation, or chemical, using a chemical signal versus a mechanical one. Like, adaptation can be kind of broadly conceptualized, if that makes sense.
You mentioned you'd prep for bodybuilding shows before. So when you were getting towards your leanest, what role did caffeine play within that? Did you find it was more important, or was it roughly the same sort of response to dosages? Because if you're lighter, maybe you need less caffeine to get the same effect because you're 3 times milligram per kilo is different.
I didn't find that, and I actually think that's one of the unique things about caffeine is, again, I will admit this is something I don't have evidence to back up, but it doesn't seem to be as related to body size as something like ethanol maybe. I think it's more related to your genetic production of that 1A2 enzyme. So I didn't find I was more sensitive. I found that I consumed around the same amount as I do at a heavier body weight. So, my leanest was probably 30 pounds lighter than I usually sit around, and I was about the same sensitivity. And I think, again, anecdotally, what you'll see is even large individuals, they may be more sensitive to caffeine than you'd expect. Like you can have super heavyweights who, maybe can handle, 2 milligrams per kilo, where based on the equation by body size, they should be having 5 to 7. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's really interesting. And again, it's another difference with this particular substance versus, like you said, ethanol, alcohol, and things like that, where definitely there's a much closer correlation between body weight and ability to handle larger volumes.
Yeah, well, and the other thing too is, there is no physiological role of ethanol. I mean, it's essentially a toxin. Like it causes things, but there's no real beneficial role. Whereas you can argue, that's interesting. I'm trying to think now off the top of my head which one has a lower toxic dose. I'm pretty sure it's ethanol, but I don't know that. Anyway, that's an aside. That's a toxicology question. We can toss that aside.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ben, I think there's been lots and lots within that conversation from a science perspective, but importantly, there's been a lot of practical takeaways as well. In terms of the ones that are sitting forefront in my mind for my discussion, there are things around the consideration around half-life, the considerations around how close to training you want to take it, or how close to a cognitive activity you want to take it. Dosages in terms of what's an effective dose for people. One of the things that you mentioned that I'd love to touch on before we wrap up was around the side effects, because I've seen people, I do a lot of presenting in my corporate job because, of course, I do lots of this stuff on the side.
Sure.
There's a bit of an overlap. I see a lot of people who get nerves before public speaking and presenting, maybe have a coffee and think that can improve things. I've said that if I'm taking quite a lot of caffeine, I feel my speech speeds up, which actually is a little bit of a negative when it comes to presenting, because you want to be slow, controlled, and measured. Is there an element of people making a mistake there by doing that, or is it a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where they're like, oh, I'm somebody that gets giggly or happy on caffeine, I'm going to have this?
I'll answer it on both sides. I'll answer it pharmacologically first, and then maybe subjectively second. So there is something there pharmacologically. So when you look at people who take beta blockers for performance enhancement, which are usually performance artists like musicians or people who need to stay in the zone and not let adrenaline actually be destructive to their performance. It's basically a block. You're blocking adrenaline's effects at the heart and at things that at places that make you feel nervous, that make you tremble a little bit, that make your heart rate go up. And like we talked about earlier in the conversation, one of the spillover, the indirect effects of consuming caffeine is you will get, a larger release of adrenaline. So absolutely pharmacologically, there's a plausible reason to say someone who's a nervous person before a presentation probably shouldn't take a stimulant, because it would amplify those nerves and amplify everything that they're kind of trying to avoid. I think the subjective answer to the question is the unavoidable thing, which is know thyself. And, for me, it's weird. Like I said, there's a double-edged sword where classic, like traditionally or on paper, I'd be defined as warrior versus warrior, but a little bit of adrenaline makes me better. Too much is a problem. So like I would probably have a caffeine drip, and I'm drip meaning a lower dose, like somewhere on that lower end, 40 milligram, maybe 100. So it's not going to spill over too much into too much adrenaline, too much excitement, too much But I'm someone that arguably could benefit from a little more extroversion as well. So I think it turns me on and it's good that it makes me talk a little faster.
Yeah, it might sharpen you just enough, but if you had too much, then it might play into that warrior piece where you'd be a bit more anxious and you wouldn't deliver to the same extent. But if you had none, then maybe you would be a little bit too level for maybe the high energy situation you want to put across.
Dose control is everything for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Ben, I've absolutely loved this conversation. I'm sure the listeners have as well. If they want to continue the conversation with you, I know you fly under the radar, but where should they head towards?
So our supplement company, myself and Omar Isa, elemental.fit. You can reach me through there. And then I have, if you like the nerdy, technical, scientific stuff, I do have a sub page called at SupSci on Instagram. I'm not as active as I'd like to be, but I always try to put out some content as regularly as I can with everything I'm juggling. But we do go into the weeds on stuff like this. And then my personal Instagram is at Ben Esgro. So if someone wanted to reach me, one of those three places or all three, you're bound to get in touch with me somehow.
Yes, I'll go and grab the links and they'll be in the show notes below. Thank you very much for joining me, Ben. And thank you to you, the listener, for tuning in as always. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.